in the Shamatha practice we're doing today, the object of this practice is the space of the mind plus whatever mental events arise in that space. And to describe this practice, sometimes certain analogies are used. One analogy that's often used here is that the mind is like the sky, and all the thoughts and so forth are like clouds moving through the sky. Another analogy sometimes used is that the mind is like the stage, and all the thoughts and so forth are like the actors on the stage. Or another one is that the mind is like a screen, and all the thoughts are like the movie projected on the screen. So we can have this idea of foreground and background, that the background is the space of the mind, and the foreground is all the things that appear in that space. So the object is not just all the appearances, all the mental events, but it's also the space of the mind. And that's something we're going to be moving into tomorrow in terms of resting in awareness. But what I'd like to do now in this practice is again do the same practice, observe the space of mind and all the events in that space, but paying particular attention to the space. The space where all thoughts emerge from, the space where all thoughts abide, and the space where they dissolve back into. So just to become more familiar with the space of the mind, because that's also part of the object, and that's where we're sort of heading tomorrow. So let's do that practice again, 15 minutes, with that emphasis on mainly focusing on the space of the mind. So we're not trying to block the thoughts in that, still observe them, but mainly focusing on the space. Maybe we can switch off the light again.
So can you put something in front of your computer? The apple of the computer is really like a flashlight.
Oh, the apple thing here?
Yes, yes.
There we go, look at that. Is that better?
Very good.
You begin as always by preparing the body. and allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. And resting your gaze in the space in front of you. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. And placing special emphasis on the space of the mind. So that is mainly focusing on the space of the mind. The space where thoughts emerge from, the space wherein they abide, and the space that they dissolve back into. So mainly focusing on the space of the mind. that gives us a little lead into tomorrow's practice of resting in awareness. Any questions about space of the mind?
And how do you observe something that doesn't have any characteristics?
Repeat the question.
How do you observe something that doesn't have any characteristics? So you're suggesting that the space of the mind has no characteristics?
For me, what came up was spaciousness, but that also felt slightly forced. I felt like I was trying to put words to something that I don't have any words for.
Often we like to, what's the word? Often we like to sort of concretize things. So when we say space of mind or mind, often we want to see that as like a thing. But is the mind like a thing? Or is it just the domain where all appearances arise? I mean, if we use an analogy, physical space, can you see physical space? You can't? You can't see the space in this room?
You're describing it by the stuff within it rather than the
Correct, but you say, I mean, you can say you can see space. But you're right. Is space a thing? Like a cup is a thing? But you can see space, can't you?
It's a framework more than it
Yeah,
is.
and so similarly with the mind.
You don't see it, this place. You know it exists.
Which, the physical space?
Yes?
You can see physical space.
No, but you can see the boundaries.
But you can see physical space. No?
No.
No?
Yes.
No, you can't?
I think so.
Yes. If you see view,
I think the mind does not exist actually.
Ah, well then we're getting into some philosophical talk now.
Philosophical, it's existential.
The mind doesn't exist?
No, I don't think that is.
No? The cup doesn't exist?
Not necessarily.
What exists?
Emptiness.
Emptiness. So cups don't exist. I think the question rather here is, how do things exist? And when we say things like the mind doesn't exist, I think what we're really saying is that the mind is not a thing. It doesn't exist as we think it does. So in that sense, we can say that the cup that we think exists doesn't exist.
But where is your mind?
Hmm?
Where is the mind?
Where is the mind?
Yes.
The mind is not physical, so it has no location. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
So if it's not a physical, then it can't occupy any space.
It can't occupy any physical space. It has no physical characteristics. Which means you could say it's everywhere
Yes.
and it's nowhere. But they're just a figure of speech. You can't really say it's located anywhere. It doesn't really make any sense because it's not a physical object. But anyway, this is something we're going to touch on in day 9.
Two questions. What is the difference between awareness and mind?
Okay. This is something we're going to touch on tomorrow, but a brief answer now. So what's the question is, what's the difference between mind and awareness? It would depend on how we understood the word mind and the word awareness. And if we speak very generally, then often mind, awareness and consciousness are the same. If we speak in a particular specific context, then these words take on a very different meaning. So we have to be very careful when we hear this in Buddhism. We heard the word mind, consciousness and awareness, because it's context specific what they mean.
Now,
but in general here,
in the
here,
practice,
yes, I'm coming to
I
this.
put my awareness in the mind.
Right. So here, when we talk about observing the mind, and tomorrow we're talking about resting in awareness, are we talking about two different things? No. No. And when you say put your awareness in the mind, you're using the word awareness as a verb or a function, to be aware of the mind.
Okay.
But we can use the word awareness as a noun, not as a verb or as a function. Because often, like for example...
So I put the awareness in the awareness, so it's good. I put my awareness...
Yeah, but you're using the... When you say put my awareness, you're talking about the function,
Yes.
to be aware.
Okay.
So then we're not using the word awareness as a noun. For example, the definition of mind in Buddhism is mind is clear and knowing. Or it can be translated as clarity and awareness. But there the word awareness is describing the function of the mind. What does the mind do? The mind is aware. So we can use the word awareness as what the mind does, to be aware of something. And so that's how we're using it here. But we can also say rest in awareness. And when we say rest in awareness, we say it's the same as saying rest in the mind.
Okay. Understand.
But in other contexts, when we use the word mind, it often means conceptual mind, conceptual. And in that context, awareness means non-conceptual. So they actually mean completely different things. So the bottom line is, we have to, when these words are used, we have to understand the context as to what they mean. Here in Shamatha, when we're saying observe the mind, rest in awareness, they mean the same thing. In other contexts, they don't mean the same thing.
Understand. And the other question is like I felt like I'm doing something maybe in the practice, maybe it's not right, like I'm widening my observation.
Widening
Wide. from
Widening your
like
observation?
doing something active when I were looking at my mind. What was the practice?
To look at the space in the mind.
So it's like I did an active angle, like I'm widening my observation.
Right, because the space is not a thing. And so if we stop trying to grab it as a thing, then automatically it's like this, isn't
So
it?
it's automatically, or I did it? I think I did it.
You
because I
could
know
be
like
because you couldn't narrow down. So yeah. But this is something we're going to be touching on in tomorrow's practice,
because
and particularly when we go into a bit of Vipassana as well.
when I'm doing myself, this is from at home. Like I'm starting with my breath and then widening to the body, widening to the space that I touch, and then widening to the space of my mind.
Oh, but that's physical space.
No, and then I'm looking at my awareness. And
Right.
this is my way to get into it. It's the easier way for me.
Yeah, good. It helps you let go of grasping, so that's good.
Yes, so but it's something that I'm doing on purpose.
Yeah, okay. So we can do certain things to lead us into something. That's good. That's okay. That's fine.
So